Hi, everyone. Still me, still Professor King. I'm still here. Wake up every morning just making sure, I didn't become somebody else, but no, still Professor King teaching English 102 at Fullerton College. And today we're going to be talking more literary terms for the poems that we'll be covering this week. I'll do some discussions of the poems in a different video, but this video will be devoted specifically to the literary terms. So as always, follow along, take notes as you go, pause as you need to. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to contact me, email Canvas, Pronto, Instagram, Zoom, however works best for you. But let's just dive right in and get these out of the way. We have 4 that we're talking about today. So I'm going to take it to the share screen. And let me just go straight into our slideshow. If you notice, the last week's last slide was synecdoche. So we're just moving forward from there. This week, we're going to be talking a lot about sort of the movement of poem and how poetry moves. If you think about poetry, what most writing, the majority of writing up until about 250 years ago, was written in poetic form. And you have to think about why that is. Why would most of our writing be written in a form that we don't necessarily speak in, right? Like it's rhymed, it's metered out, meaning it has like a rhythm to it. It has a sort of a beat. A lot of times there are things like repetition and alliteration, and imagery. So we have to think like, why up until, give or take 250 years ago, was this the case? Was writing mostly written in this form? Take a guess. Well, I'm not going to hear it, but take a guess on your own. Well, some of the reasons are, one, literacy rates. If you think about, like the literacy rates of any given, and this is more so in the Western tradition that we're talking about. But if you think about the literacy rates in any given society, by and large, the majority of the members of any given Western society were largely illiterate up until only a couple centuries ago. And so how is it easy to remember information, stories, narratives, et cetera, et cetera? Well, it's easy to remember it when it's in song form or in some sort of rhythmic form. If you can create that sort of rhythmic form to tell a story, that's going to be a lot easier for the person telling the story to remember than if they've just got to like read 40 pages out of a novel, right? So you see, with the advent of literacy in the Western tradition, also comes the advent of more emphasis on things like short stories and novels, which we'll be getting to. But up until then, much of what we had was in poetic form. And again, a lot of that poetic form was set to song, so that when people told these stories and could share these narratives, again, they could remember it easily, their audience could easily digest it and remember it, and it could be disseminated orally, if not written down, because a lot of people couldn't read or write. And then you have real sly foxes, like Miguel de Cervantes in Spain, who starts writing just like, one of the most killer novels in history, Don Quixote, and just throws all that out of the water, right? And other guys, I mean, there's Italian writers in the 16th century, and the Bible to a certain extent, but even that was passed down through oral tradition, clearly. So when we think about the poetic tradition, this is a long, rich, and widely utilized up until very recently tradition. And poetry still is around today, and clearly music is still around today. So it's lasting, right? Like, even though we can now, by and large, in most Western cultures, read and write, and so we can do things like read novels or magazine articles or scholarly journal articles or or biographies, you know, we still crave the musicality and the rhythm of poetry. And I don't think that'll ever leave us, hopefully. I would hate to see a world without poetry and music. So we're going to be looking at those aspects today, and again, how they function, why they exist, what they do. So the first one we're looking at is rhythm, right? Just the sort of general overall idea of rhythm. And rhythm is the movement of sound within a poem when that poem is spoken out loud, or you can, again, like, hear it in your head. It's created, or it's achieved through the it's that is a bad. Am I even an English professor? What's going on here? It is achieved through stresses. There we go. Stresses and pauses of the words and syllables found within any given line. There you go, Professor King. Just, you know, revise every once in a while. So the way that words sound when they come out of our mouths is important, because when we put those to song, when we put those to poetry, it's going to create a certain rhythm. Okay. And why is that important? Well, if you think about, let's say, American English versus British English, we pronounce certain words, not all words, but we pronounce certain words differently. And so if the stress on the syllables of the word are different, then if that word is placed within the context of, say, a poem, the whole rhythm of that poem is going to change. So for example, you know, if anyone's ever had like a pain, you may have taken Vicodin. We call it Vicodin. The stress is on the first syllable, the vi, right? It's a 3-syllable word, Vicodin, and the stress is on vi. Now, if you were in England taking that exact same drug and you had to go to a pharmacist and ask for it, you would ask for Vicodin. So the stress there is on the second word, Vicodin. So let's think about that in terms of, like, if we put it in the middle of other words, the stress, if the stress in that word is changing, then the rhythm of that word changes the whole rhythm of everything around it, right? And so if you think about it in terms of like a beat, right? A heartbeat, a music beat, whatever you want to call it, this little bottom picture here, you can see, like, if one of these beats changed and maybe moved back, you know, half a beat or whatever. I'm not a music person, so I don't know what it's called. It would change the whole composition of that whole line. And so we kind of take rhythm for granted, but it's very important that we understand what is going on in terms of rhythm and how words are meant to be pronounced within, say, a poem or a song, so that we can follow that flow more easily, right? So that's sort of general rhythm. There's sometimes a break in rhythm within a given line called a caesura. And for an example that a lot of you may know from Shakespeare is to be or not to be. That is the question. So that pause after, you know, to be or not to be, that's the caesura, right? And what that does is it creates emphasis on certain lines, on certain concepts. It brings your attention to them. It allows you to pause and sort of, you know, understand the dramatic effect that's taking place. It does all sorts of things. So again, we may take these sorts of rhythms for granted, but we really have to listen to them as we read poetry so that we understand, again, how that poem is functioning. When we talk about rhythm, we have to talk about meter, because the meter is the pattern of how the syllables are stressed and unstressed within words and among words, and that meter is measured by what's called a foot. Okay, so some of you may have heard like iambic pentameter. That's typical in Shakespearean poetry, some Shakespeare plays, where you have 10 syllables, and those 10 syllables are cut up into series of stressed and unstressed. So an iamb goes unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. So in other words, an iamb is the thing where you have an unstressed syllable and then followed by a stressed syllable. Pentameter, if you know what pent means 5. That means there's 5 groups of iambs. So unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, making 10 syllables total. Okay, so there's a little bit of math involved in English, oddly enough. Again, when we're talking about rhythm, we need to know that math because we need to see what the poem is doing in our minds, in our ears as we're listening to it. There are all different kinds of meters. Iambic pentameter is just one of them. Another one is what's called anapaests. Anapaests aren't, unlike iambs, which are unstressed or unstressed stressed. Anapaests are unstressed, unstressed, stressed. So if you think about like to be or not to be, that is the question, right? And questions kind of floating around out there at the end. Those are iambs because you have unstressed, stressed, to be or not to be, unstressed, stressed, right? Anapaest is now 3 syllables. So iambs are 2, anapaest is 3. It goes unstressed, unstressed, stressed. So if you listen to something like the Gilligan's Island theme song, you're going to hear the meter, the ballad meter of anapaest. Okay, and you don't need to know iamb or anapaest, but you need to be able to know what the measurements are called and within the writing, and you need to be able to hear them or listen to them as you read, right? So I'm going to play the Gilligan's Island theme song for you in this video and see if you can hear the anapaest.
Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from this tropic port aboard this tiny ship. The mate was a mighty sailing man, the skipper brave and sure. 5 passengers set sail that day for a 3-hour tour. A 3-hour tour. Started getting rough, the tiny ship was tossed. If not for the courage of the fearless crew, the minnow would be lost. The minnow would be lost. The ship's aground on the shore of this uncharted desert isle, with Gilligan, the skipper too, a millionaire and his wife, the movie star, the professor and Mary Ann, here on Gilligan's Island. Now,
Tina Louise, I would give my left arm to look like her. Anyway, so did you hear that? Dun 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 dun. See that even within that there are more syllables, right? So it's really dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun, right? It's that unstressed, unstressed, stressed. So that, we can hear that, we can feel it, we can measure it. And if we didn't, if the syllables were just all over the place, then it would be chaos, right? It wouldn't be a rhythmic song. It would just be like, right? And like there's like noise rock like that or whatever you want to call it. But when we're thinking about sort of the traditional modes of rhythm, we have to kind of stick to the measurements, right? All right. We also have what are called prose poems. And this is, again, where we kind of diverge from rhythm and meter and write poetry that sounds as if we're just talking, right? As if we're just reading a paragraph, essentially. So a prose poem is written at least loosely in paragraph form, in open form or free verse, in which rhyme scheme and metrical feet aren't discernible. So this is not going to have that sort of like clap, that sort of clap along rhythm to it. It's going to have the not necessarily balanced rhythm of everyday speech. Okay, so if you look at like this example from Max Jacob, this is a prose poem entitled "Hell is Graduated." When I was employed at Cooperative Fashions, in spite of the dark, ugly old maid, I tried to steal some garters. I was pursued down the superb staircases. Hear that sibilance, that alliteration we learned last week? Not for the theft, but for my laziness at work and for my hatred of the innocent finery. Descend, you are pursued. Again, if we think about Caesura, it's still happening. Descend, you are pursued. The staircases are less beautiful in the offices than in the part open to the public. The staircases are less beautiful in the service quarters than in the offices. The staircases are still less beautiful in the cellar. Repetition, right? The staircases are, the staircases are, the staircases are. But what can I say of the marsh where I arrived? What can I say of the laughter, of the animals that brushed by me, and of the whispering of unseen creatures? Water gave place to fire, to fear, to unconsciousness. Fire, fear. Do we hear that alliteration? When I came to myself, I was in the hands of silent and nameless surgeons. Okay. So there is still a rhythm there. It's just the rhythm of, again, everyday speech, of paragraph form. So we're not going to have that like, when I was employed at Cooperative Fashions, right? Like you could probably try it, but it's not going to fit very well. So that's another type of rhythm that we can look at, is the rhythm of prose, right? And that's what we see when we see prose poems. And then finally, we have sonnets. And sonnets deal not only with rhythm, but with rhyme scheme. And there are different types of sonnets we need to know about. All a sonnet is a 14-line poem that's written in rhyme lines in iambic pentameter in a specific type of meter. Again, that unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, 10 syllables, 5 groupings, okay? But they're 14 lines. And so there are certain ways of rhyming that even within the rhyme create a rhythm. The first one is Shakespearean, or an English sonnet, which has a couplet at its ending with a rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Or you also have an Italian, or what's known as a Petrarchan sonnet, which is an octave, 8 lines, followed by a sestet, the next 6 lines, making a total of 14 lines, making the sonnet of any rhyming pattern. Okay, or I'm sorry, of A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, and then the sestet is any rhyming pattern. Okay. So if we look at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet, and that's probably already kind of giving away, but let's look just to make sure. Let's consider how this sonnet form plays out. Okay. 2 households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end not could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage. The which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend. So if we're thinking about rhyme scheme, when we're talking about A, B, A, B, what that means is the A's are the same, the B's are the same, the C's are the same, but they're different from each other. So if we look at the color scheme here, dignity, mutiny, those would be A. Seen, unclean, those would be B. So right now we have A, B, A, B, okay? Foes, overthrows, life, strife. Those are different, but they're not the same as dignity and seen and mutiny, unclean. So now we have C, D, C, D. So it's looking so far like it's a Shakespearean sonnet. Let's see if it goes all the way to the end. Love, rage, remove, stage. E, F, E, F, right? New rhymes that are similar to one another, but are dissimilar to the rhymes that came before them. And then G, G, right? Attend, mend. Okay. So clearly, I mean, it's written by Shakespeare, so that was the big giveaway. But this is a Shakespearean sonnet because it has iambic pentameter, it's got 14 lines, and it's got the rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G that you see here. Okay. So it's a good idea to know these different forms when we're looking at poetry, because again, a certain rhythm is going to create a certain impression in the audience. And I'm going to take it off share screen now, I think. Yeah. If you think about a rap song, a 90s gangster rap song versus like, a 2021 country song, their rhythms are very different and they create different impressions in their audience. They could be talking about very similar things, right? Like loss or love or whatever. But because those rhyme schemes are different, that contributes to the difference in the overall impression between one and the other. And so that's why it's so important when we think about rhythm as it pertains to poetry, because a certain rhythm is going to elicit a certain understanding from the audience as to what the writer is trying to get at. It's also going to tell us sometimes, like in with something like a Shakespearean sonnet, typically either what time in history the poem was written or what time in history the poem is referencing, right, or alluding to. So not a lot of people are writing Shakespearean sonnets in 2021. If they are, it's sort of like a nod to these previous forms, and they're probably doing something to play on those. So that's, then we bring the historical element into this discussion of rhythm too. So again, it's not just looking at these things as if they are all separate and all sort of like their own thing. It's seeing how alliteration affects rhythm and how poem form affects the time in history in which it was written, or affects our understanding of that at least, and all of these things. So everything is working in this sort of network, cloudy network of what's going on. So keep that in mind, again, as you're thinking about the rhythm of poetry. I hope that was helpful. I hope everyone is doing wonderfully. I hope you have a wonderful night and rest of your day. And I hope you contact me if you have any questions or concerns. But I'm going to leave now. And I will see you soon in cyberspace. Bye.